Thank you for coming. Is that too loud? I'm delighted to see such a good turnout this afternoon, especially when the weather has gone so foul on us. But here we are for the 20th year of the Mildred Snitcher Lectures in Asian Art. And I want to give a shout out of thanks to Mildred's daughters. Two of them are with us this afternoon, Dory and Susan. Would you be kind enough to stand up and be recognized by the audience? Mildred's three daughters and quite a few members of the Asian Art Council who were dear friends of Mildred Snitzer contributed to establish this fund in 1975, and people have continued to contribute. So this is the oldest funded lecture series at the Art Museum, and it has been a wonderful way for us to bring in esteemed scholars and curators from all over the country. And here on our sort of 20th anniversary, it's only the second time that we're bringing in an internationally renowned artist. I am so thrilled and honored to introduce today's speaker, who's disappeared. Arnold, where are you?
I'm over here.
Oh, there he is, okay. Somewhere over there is Arnold, okay. Whose career I have followed with great interest for a long time. We've often been in the same place, but at different times. We have many shared friends. And in the times that I have known about him, my knowledge of him has evolved from being a very astute connoisseur of Chinese painting who established the Chinese painting program at Sotheby's in New York at a time when there really wasn't a market for Chinese painting in North America. He was with Sotheby's for 15 years, and then he moved to Cahill, which is a private gallery. If you've come to New York with me for Asia Week, you have visited them. Cahill is, I think, quite distinctive in New York for being founded by scholars. And so Arnold was with them for 10 years, and that's when I sort of really began to learn about him. But now he has transmogrified into being a full-time, very successful and greatly admired artist. Let's see. What else did I want to say? Oh, yes, okay. You have other information about him in your handouts, and he will tell you more about his life. And he had a very unusual journey to become a painter, crossing paths with the unquestionable luminaries of both scholarship and painting in this country. And now I have an updated list of where the museums that have his paintings: the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the British Museum, the Phoenix Art Museum, the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco, LA County Museum, Chicago Art Institute, and at universities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Cornell, and UC Berkeley. And I hope that you will help me add our name to that list. So, Arnold Chang.
Okay, thank you. Am I mic? Can you hear me? Yes. Oh, that's great. All right, so where's my clicker? Spoiler alert, the title of my talk is, Does the Past Have a Future in Traditional Chinese Painting? The answer is yes. So this is me. I grew up in New York City. So that's me at the age of 10, tough guy, as most New Yorkers are. And it was a year before, in 1963, that I saw my first exhibition of Chinese paintings. We grew up in New York, as I mentioned. My father and mother both came from China. My mother was half Scottish and half Chinese. We lived in New York with my Scottish grandmother, so English was our first language, and we lived a very kind of, I guess the point of that generation of immigrants was for us to assimilate. So I wasn't really steeped in Chinese traditions and culture from a young age, but then I went to this exhibition in, of all places, the Herschel Adler Galleries in New York City, and I saw this work by this man named Zhang Daqian. Here's a photo of him. He's probably the most famous one of the most famous 20th century Chinese artists, and he lived in South America as well as in Carmel, California. And so if you want to learn one important Chinese artist's name for the 20th century, that's one of the ones you must know. He's also one of the most popular in terms of the marketplace. And for at least a couple of years, the total sales of his work at auction exceeded Picasso. So he's somebody, everybody knows Picasso, everybody in China knows Picasso, but not that many people, of course you know because you're in Friends of Asian Art, but most people don't know Zhang Daqian. Anyway, it made such an impact on me that it really changed the course of my entire life. Zhang Daqian was a remarkable painter. He worked in lots of different styles. He could do fine line figures. He could do splashed color landscapes. He could do lotus flowers, huge lotus flowers with broad brush strokes. And as a young 10-year-old or 9-year-old, it just totally blew my circuits because I'd never seen anything quite like it. So this is me in high school. As you can see, I went to the Bronx High School of Science. So in New York, there were specialized high schools that you had to take a test for. So I took the test for both Bronx Science and for Music and Art High School. And I made the choice, the sensible choice to go to Bronx Science because it was higher academic, the credentials were higher and it seemed to be the better place to go. But once I got there, well, you can see, it wasn't quite me, if you know what I'm saying. Now, most of my friends went to music and art, and most of them, in fact, were musicians. But I decided to go to Bronx Science and do the right thing and hated every minute of it. So while my classmates were taking astrogeophysics and all these great electives, I was trying to do art and creative writing and stuff like that. Anyway, while I was in high school, I continued a little bit of my interest in Chinese painting. And my father, when he was back in China, had actually been a photographer as a young person, had taken very good photos and even won some prizes, according to what my mom told me. And this is a painting that I did that is it's a kind of a copy of one of my father's photographs. In fact, it was the only one that my mother still had. And it got the feeling of a Chinese painting. It's not really a Chinese painting in the sense that it's on watercolor. It's with watercolor, black and gray watercolors on watercolor paper. But that was my first attempt at doing something that sort of looked like a Chinese painting because it was based on a photo taken in China. And at that point, I asked my father if he could find me a teacher because I was interested in learning more seriously about Chinese painting. The man he found was this guy named Wang Jiyuan. He happened to have a studio, he called it the School of Chinese Brushwork, which was actually an apartment which, as fate would have it, was across the street from our apartment on East 72nd Street. So I went there to learn Chinese painting from him. Now, I didn't know who he was. You have to bear in mind also that I didn't speak a word of Chinese. Growing up, we all spoke English in the household. My parents spoke Shanghai dialect with each other, and they both spoke Mandarin, but as kids, we never learned it. And his English was pretty poor. But it turns out, I learned this later, that back in the day, when he was in China, as a young man, he was considered really forward-looking, really avant-garde, because he was doing Western art. So he was learning from European and Matisse and all these kind of things. And so in China, back in the 30s and early 40s, he was considered ahead of his time. So he emigrated to the United States in the early 40s and found out when he got here that what he was doing here was not particularly popular, and he couldn't really find a niche because he wasn't all that special once he got to New York. And so he went back to ink painting. Now, he even had organized an exhibition of modern Chinese paintings in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1943, which nobody knows about, and included quite a few of his own work. So at one point, he was pretty well known. But what his whole approach was, he was trying to develop a hybrid style that used Chinese materials, brush and ink, but sort of modernizing it in terms of subject matter, in terms of approach. So he did like a scene of I guess that's the East River or some New York's river scene, and he did these kind of apples in the sort of Cézanne-esque mode, but with traditional Chinese brush and ink. And so that was his approach, and I think the approach of a lot of artists of that generation, of trying to modernize what they considered to be a tradition that was sort of in the decline. Now, because my father introduced me to him, he was a friend of Zhang Daqian, that first artist I showed you. So my father thought, oh, this guy will be good. And because I have, Chinese heritage, he decided that it was important that I had to do Chinese calligraphy before I could do Chinese painting. So the writing comes first. Now, that didn't necessarily take into account that I didn't know any Chinese. But I dutifully, and I had no idea what this meant. I thought, okay, well, he's had me copying characters. So I copied some characters, we'll do this for a week or two. And then, all the other students were sitting around using brush and ink and doing, still lifes, which was also kind of weird. Looking back, it was sort of a weird approach. It was doing still lifes, but using Chinese materials, which is not, which again is a kind of hybrid approach. But anyway, so he had me doing these Chinese characters, and I was copying them, but I didn't know really what I was writing. So I'm probably one of the few people who learned to write before I could either speak or read. But the thing about it was I got into it because I really enjoyed the feeling of brush and interacting with white paper, and I just, got into it. And this was a few years later, but I used to practice for hours at a time. And so I figured, if I'm going to do this, I should sort of learn Chinese. So that's what I did. I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder because it was pretty. And I started as a studio art major, but those were the days when the way they taught art was you just have to be creative, do your own thing, original and all this. Nobody taught you how to draw, nobody taught you how to paint. And they would have us do these projects, and I loved the idea of going to the studio late at night and listening to music and doing my artwork. But then they would, there would basically no guidance from the instructors at all. Then they would have a critique and they would just tear you apart, rip you to shreds. For completely subjective reasons. I sort of couldn't understand. I didn't really learn too much from that experience. So I switched to Asian studies and started to learn more about Chinese art, Chinese culture, history, etc., not knowing what I was getting into in that manner also, because it's not so easy. So these are some of my kind of first attempts, earlier attempts, and I realized that it was sort of taking the approach of that teacher, Wang Jian, who was kind of hybridizing, who's sort of using Chinese techniques and Chinese materials in a sort of pseudo-Chinese way. So that's where I started out, and I began to realize that I really was hoping for something a little bit more authentic, although I didn't quite know what that meant. And I'm telling you all this background because it's important to see where I finally ended up, that I started with somebody whose idea was to combine East and West in a very, what turns out to be fairly superficial way, and not really getting to the core of what makes Chinese art Chinese and what makes Western art Western or modern or whatever. So that's where I started. Then I went to Taiwan for my junior year, where I studied Chinese intensively. And I studied with this man named Guo Yanqiao, who's not famous. I don't even have a good photo of him. Very nice man. So I was there I lived in Taiwan just for 1 year doing my junior year, and I'm doing lots of Chinese language training and also painting. And he painted like this. His work is very, very, I'll use the word traditional, very, very orthodox. He was, unlike Wang Jiyuan, my first teacher, Guo Yanqiao, he really thought you had to do things the old-fashioned, let's say he was old-fashioned. You had to do it this way. Landscapes had to be this way. And it was also good training, but I also felt like at the end of the day, he wasn't doing anything particularly creative, but I respected what he was doing in relation to the tradition. When I first started studying with him, he asked us to, he would paint a tree or simple landscape and ask us to copy, to give us homework, copy the tree. So as a Westerner, my approach was, I'd watch him, see how he did his tree. Then I would go home and I'd paint a whole bunch of different trees. And I would come back the next time, and he was very disappointed because that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to copy what he did. And okay, so I learned that gradually. And so these are some of the early copies of, he would give us the works to copy. He had a whole stacks of different subjects and things. And so I would dutifully copy what he had done, and that was a very useful process, and use traditional materials. Now, just a word on tradition. The handing down of statements, beliefs, legend, customs, information, etc. The key here is from generation to generation. Or number 4, a continuing pattern of culture, beliefs, or practices. So nowadays, when people hear the word tradition, they think it means past. And in some uses, I guess that's acceptable. But for me, the idea of tradition is something that's ongoing. So, tradition exists in the past and the present, and it anticipates the future. So we have our religious traditions, we have our family traditions, people come for Easter, come for Christmas, whatever it is, and you hope that will be handed down from generation to generation. That's sort of the whole point of it. And that's my attitude about traditional Chinese painting. And it's quite extraordinary that of all the great art traditions in the world, Chinese painting, in a way, is one of the most clearly unbroken tradition for at least 2,000 years. And so when I hear a lot of people, when they're talking about art, Chinese art, they say, well, it's either traditional or it's modern or it's contemporary, cutting, so they think of contemporary as something cutting edge right now, and traditional as something that happened before. But what happens when you're an artist living today, a contemporary artist who is embracing the traditions that you have inherited? It puts you in a little bit of a different position. And is it possible to be both a traditional artist and a contemporary artist? And the answer, of course, is yes. But it's not easy. How do we do that? So as Wen Fang, who was a great professor back east in Princeton, and he was also the curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, he writes, the historical pattern seen by Chinese artists was not one of progress in which the new replaced the old. It was rather an enduring effort on the part of succeeding generations of artists to gain or restore life and truth to art. Ancient masters were perceived in a non-historical continuum in which later masters, in achieving self-realization through inner responses to both nature and art, emerge as their equals rather than as mere followers. They too become ancestors. So the idea here is this idea of a non-historical continuum, or a trans-historical continuum where as you learn, what you try to do is you absorb what you can of what came before, and then you find your own lineage within the great tradition of Chinese art. Now, of course, Chinese painting is not one singular tradition. There are all kinds of traditions of Chinese painting. There's Buddhist art, there's folk traditions of painting, but the one that gets the most attention and the one that I'm most interested in is something that generally we refer to as the literati tradition or Wenren tradition, which got its start in the late Sung Dynasty, 12th century, and really reaches its peak in the Yuan Dynasty, 14th century. So this is Professor James Cahill, who some of you probably knew. I know some of you knew. And I was going to make a lame attempt to describe Wen Fang and Cahill as the equivalent of well, it won't work for this audience. I was going to say Tupac and the Notorious B.I.G. But anyway, they like to argue amongst between each other about different paintings and about different ideas. But Jim Cahill, among others, was one of the first American scholars to really grapple with the idea of this literati tradition. And I've written just a couple of lines about how he explained the difference between so-called literati painting, especially as it appears in the 13th, 14th century, and what came before. So he's saying the quality of expression in a picture is principally determined by the personal qualities of the man who creates it and the circumstances under which he creates it. And secondly, the expressive content of a picture may be partially or wholly independent of its representational content. In other words, something more, a shift so that the art is something closer to what we think of as self-expression, but using landscape in particular as a vehicle to express one's inner feelings, rather than landscape as a picture of a scene or a realistic depiction of an actual place. So he points to the late 13th century into the 14th century as its pivotal time. And one of the great scholar artists of that period is this man named Moonfool. And this kind of painting, if you know about Sung Dynasty painting, this is quite a difference. If you look at the one on the top, it's really clearly not photographic. The artist has combined two separate mountains that actually are not anywhere near each other. You couldn't actually see this vision at all because they're separated by miles and miles. But he's reduced it to a kind of semi-abstract, almost primitivist image where the trees and the rocks, the idea of scale and proportion and just the overall treatment of all the details have a kind of primitive natural quality, and that's what he was going for. Now this is 14th century, so this is not because they didn't know how to paint. This was a conscious decision to be doing something beyond pictorial representation. So each line has a expressive quality in and of itself, in addition to describing a particular form. And the lower one you can see is very simple. It's a small hand scroll, but it's got almost no details. But if you see it in person, it just is so amazing. So the content of the painting, the meaning of the painting is this sort of bland, it doesn't call attention to itself. It's very internalized. It's a very personal approach to art and personal vision of nature. And this is what we call the literati tradition. And this was the lineage that I personally became drawn to. So here's another one of these great Yuan Dynasty paintings by one of the so-called four Yuan masters, Wang Bong. And you can see the detail on the right. Well, if you look at the overall composition, clearly this is not again, not a photo of a particular place. It's built up, you can tell that it's a landscape. There are trees, these are rock forms, but the rock forms are not really based on something that is in front of him. It's kind of coming up with a way to use the drawing itself to reconstruct a world where rocks and trees and waterfalls exist. So then the next way, the question is, so each generation tries to absorb what came before in whatever way they can. And that starts by copying works from earlier painters. But eventually, if you're lucky and if you have the skill and if you have the talent, you try to develop your own take on the tradition. And one of the ways that artists develop is to do works that are in the imitation of a previous master. So the painting on the left is the 14th century Yuan Dynasty painting by Zhao Moonfool called Qingbian Mountains. And another great artist of the 17th century named Dong Chang does his version of this same theme, which is now in the Cleveland Museum of Art, one of their great masterpieces. And so you can see it's not a direct copy, but what he's trying to do is capture the essence of the earlier artist's style and then somehow put his own imprint on it. And so this is one way that the tradition continues. And this one Chinese word fang means creative imitation. In other words, it's not just copying. A lot of people think that the Chinese paintings go on and on, they just keep copying each other. But in order for the artist to actually become an important artist, you have to go beyond just copying and get to a point where you're reinterpreting or you're adding something to the original model, and that's called fang. And this is a concept that Cahill was very good in articulating, even in English. So I was very fortunate to study with James Cahill, who was one of the great art historians and one of the real pioneers of Chinese painting studies in America. And here you can see some details. So it's really clearly not a drawing of an actual place, but it's capturing the essence of landscape, forms, and energy, qi, and just the interaction of trees and rocks, and it just becomes a very organic kind of an approach, where the most important thing is the quality of the drawing itself, the quality of the lines and the washes and the dots. Through Cahill, I met this man named Cece Wong, who some of you may have heard of also. His name was actually Wang Chen, but everybody knew him as Cece Wong. And he was one of the great collectors, connoisseurs, and artists who lived in New York. So I was in Berkeley studying with James Cahill and was introduced to Mr. Wong, and we all knew him because a lot of the works that we had studied in the books said, collection of Cece Wong, or formerly collection of Cece Wong, and that's how we knew him mostly. And even today, he's more well known as a collector and a connoisseur than he is as a painter, and I think his painting is really underrated because, or I should say, he's overshadowed by the other work that he did as a collector, scholar. I would say dealer, but he didn't like to be called a dealer. But I think there's nothing wrong with being a dealer. So I met Cece Wong, and he was offering 2 classes in San Francisco. So I took his classes. Now, of course, if you've all had art history classes, and Cahill is very good at taking the image, like I just showed you, and showing details and explaining the composition and analyzing the style, stylistic analysis, so on and so forth, tying it in with the biography of the artist, and really giving us a strong background in how to look at a Chinese painting, how to place it within a historical context, and all that. And I'm very grateful for that. I studied with him for only 2 years, got a master's degree. And then I was going to go into the PhD program, but then I met Cece Wong. And I thought, oh, this guy really knows something. I took these 2 classes, and I thought I'd go back to New York for a while and then come back and get my PhD. Well, I never came back. But Cece Wong gave a class, and he also showed slides. But these literally were Cece Wong slides. He only showed details. He never showed the whole image, because what really interests him is the drawing itself. I mean, he would, oops, sorry. He would, lost him. He would like talk about, look how beautiful this line is. Look at the quality of the drawing. Look, he didn't even talk about the composition or the space. Of course, he could see it, but he was just more interested in the textures and the way that the line was drawn and how beautiful. And I lost my pointer, but anyway. So that was a very different approach. And as I said, I ended up studying with Cece Wong for like 25 years until he died. Never made it back to Cahill. So the thing about Cece Wong, I mentioned when I was studying in Taiwan with Guoyan Chao that he would do simple paintings for us to copy. And that's sort of the standard way that everybody learns Chinese painting. The thing about Cece Wong is that he was a great collector. And most Chinese painting teachers, they say, well, this is how you do it. You paint like, this is how I do a tree. This is how I do a rock. You copy it. You learn my style. Cece Wong says, no, don't learn my style. Don't copy my work. Learn from the old masters directly. And he had works by the old masters. He had paintings for the Song Yuan, Ming and Qing, all of the big name artists. And I would go to his house from morning to night. And the first thing he'd ask me is, Zhang Hong, Arnold, that's my Chinese name, what would you like to paint today? And he'd have a stack of scrolls. And it was like a kid in a candy shop. It's like, one day I would paint hanging scrolls, larger pieces. One day I would paint hand scrolls or album leaves. And I could pick whatever I wanted. It was just extraordinary. And, he would go about his business, selling his real estate and stocks and stuff. And then he would come over every now and then, make a few comments, sometimes add a few lines. So the painting on the right is back to this Dongqi Chang guy, 1555, 1636. It's one leaf from a remarkable album that was in Cece Wong's collection at the time, and I got to copy the whole thing. He then later sold it to the Nelson Atkins Gallery in Kansas City. It's one of their great treasures. But I got to copy it before it left his hands. So my copy on the left is a close copy. So here I'm not doing the creative imitation, the Fang. I'm doing an actual close copy, but it was a straight off copy. I just copied line for line, and pretty good. But through this process, because I was copying Dongqi Chang's works in the style of the old masters, not only was I learning Dongqi Chang's brushwork, but I was also getting a sense of how he was interpreting what came before. So I learned, very tactily this idea of Fang, creative imitation, and what it meant. So here's a couple of, I'm just going to go through a couple. This is a painting on the right, is a landscape by Bada Sharon, one of the famous painters. You probably know him from his birds and fish and things. He also, late in his life, he did landscapes. So that's a great Bada Sharon landscape that was in the Cece Wong collection. On the left is a Cece Wong painting that in some ways relates compositionally to it. And this is a late 20th century version of Fang, creative imitation, that embraces the tradition, fully understands it, and then restates it in a new way. Here's another one. This is another great album leaf on the right by the 17th century painter Shi Tao. And a Cece Wong painting that is clearly inspired by this kind of painting that he owned. And it's not a direct copy. He wasn't looking at that painting when he did it. He was just kind of remembering in his mind's eye the technique and the brushwork and the sensibility of the Shitao painting and reinterpreting it into his own vocabulary. So now I'm just going to show you a few of my works on the left that are in some way relate to, I think, some early masters. It doesn't matter who, but the one on the right is a 14th century painter named Nizan. And my interpretation is a little different. One of the few Nizan imitations that doesn't have the little house, because I found that superfluous. So this upper left is a detail of a great Yuan Dynasty artist, Fang Chongyi, that's in the Metropolitan Museum, and a painting that I did that has something of that flavor. So it doesn't mean that even when I did this painting, I was necessarily even thinking of that particular painting or that particular artist. But this is the way, you by copying older masters and looking and looking and looking and learning, it becomes part of you. And then whatever you paint, it will have echoes. And so it's after the fact that I put these pairs together. This is Wang Yuanqi on the left, and here I have a closer relationship, I think, in terms of style, because I really like Wang Yuanqi as a painter. He's another early 18th century painter. The one on the right in the Princeton University Art Museum on the left is a 16th century painter named Wu Bin. So it's not, as I say, it's not a direct one-to-one correlation, but I mean, you have copies like that as well. But what we're really trying to do is absorb the models and kind of get the essence of it and restate it in your own way. And whether that's consciously contemporary or not is really not that important, because as a contemporary person, no matter what you do, it's going to be contemporary. It just depends how the audience receives it, whether they think it's just traditional or whether they understand what's new about it. I mean, being contemporary is, I think you could also say you're just trying to find your own personal interpretation within this long tradition. And I'll just run by a couple of works. Now, none of these are based on anything in particular. So it's like an amalgam of looking at hundreds and hundreds of Chinese paintings and copying lots of them and coming up with things that resonate with past traditions. Now, 2008, or actually 2010 to 2011, there was an exhibition in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston called Fresh Ink. And I was invited as one of 10 artists to participate in this show. And I was the only American-born artist that was invited. And the idea was that we would find a painting or an artwork in the permanent collection of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and do a new take on that work. And they assumed that we would all pick some Song Dynasty painting and then do a riff on this. But artists being artists, we all had different ideas. Now, I picked Jackson Pollock. Not because I'm a great fan of Jackson Pollock, but because I looked through and saw that the MFA only has 2 Jackson Pollock paintings. One is an early vertical work, and the other one is this horizontal piece, which, as soon as I saw it, reminded me of a hand scroll. So I thought that this would be a good piece for me to choose to have a dialogue with, and I thought it was valid, since I'm an American, that I had the right to choose an American artist and turn it into, and relate to it in a different way. Now, one thing I didn't want to do was do an inky drip painting. I wanted it to be an actual Chinese painting that somehow had a similar kind of energy. And I thought about Jackson Pollock. He worked in the studio with the canvas on the ground, and we think of him as splashing, but he didn't really splash. He really controlled the paint that he was putting on, so it became a line. And so he wasn't doing this. He was really drawing in the air and using gravity to create these lines. And then he used paint that was opaque and one layer over the other. Now, what we do, we also work flat on the table, which I'm going to show you. but the paper is different, the materials are different, it absorbs. So even though we have layers, the layers blend together. But there's a certain similarity of the idea of working on a flat surface. So when we had this show in Boston, which was great, they allowed us to show the Pollock flat, which ordinarily they don't do. And you can walk around it. Oops, I turned it off. Oh, okay. So I also did this sort of preliminary, you could call it a sketch or drawing. And what this is, you see two images there, but it's actually the same image turned upside down. So I was playing with this idea that Pollock, when he's actually working on these things, he may not know what the ultimate orientation of how it's going to be hung on the wall is going to be, because he's walking around it. And so I tried to do a painting that would work either way, up or down. And I think it's pretty successful. But on the other hand, I didn't want to just show this because it seemed a little gimmicky. And people would say, oh, he did, that's all there was to it. It's just, oh, you can turn it around, that's cool. But I wanted something beyond that. So I actually used this as a kind of preliminary drawing. But it did give me some ideas. So I started doing works that are much more like that, where there isn't a clear-cut orientation. Here's two works from 2011. You can turn them on the side, and they work equally well, and they feel different. So that was one way that, for me, to expand on the tradition without compromising my basic integrity of the tradition. If you want to call them abstract, that's fine, but you can also see that there are kind of landscape elements in them. So if you want to call it a Chinese landscape, I think you're justified. I could describe these paintings in the same way that I describe a 17th century painting by Dong Qichang in terms of energy, in terms of brushwork, in terms of light, dark, dry, wet, in terms of ambiguous spatial quality, and all these things. It still applies. If you want to just call it an abstract painting, that's fine with me too. But that's the way in which this is a more contemporary interpretation of traditional principles as well as traditional techniques. Now, the one on the right is a painting that I did, and the one on the left is an aerial photograph. And unfortunately, I got it offline, and I don't know who actually did it. But again, I'm not copying that, but I'm certainly influenced by the fact that we now have aerial photography, we have Google Earth, we have all of these things that the ancient masters could not have had, although they had the idea, they understood that mountain ranges are connected. But they couldn't actually get high enough to see how they're connected, but they intuited that. We can actually see it. So I think a lot of my more recent work is, again, you can call it abstract. Some of it has more specific references to trees or whatever. But when you look at aerial photographs or satellite images, you can't really tell which way is up, because there isn't really an up or down. And when you look at the mountaintops or the valleys, you can't really tell which is taller and which is shorter. So it's another point of view, but you can still use the paintings, the same techniques to express these qualities of nature. And just to show you a few more, I've been moving in the direction of color and maybe somewhat more abstract, but so I don't have houses and little figures and with the staff and all that, because I think what happens there is that you're defining the time and place. And are we meant to look at that as an 18th century figure, or should we draw a guy in a with Nikes and a running suit? That makes it contemporary. I think let's forget about all that. Let's just look at the nature and go for something that's hopefully more timeless in terms of its beauty. I'm working now on a big painting that I've been working on for literally for years. That doesn't mean I work on it every day, but but I've worked on it and put it away and brought it out again. This is about 2 feet by 18 feet or something like that. And I'm bound and determined to finish this soon. These are some details. So again, they sort of look like trees, they sort of look like water, they sort of look like rocks, I don't know. But it's Chinese ink painting. Now, I just want to stop here and mention, most of you probably, some of you know who this is, Michael Cherney. These 2 works are in the collection of the Portland Art Museum. And by the way, I love these 2 specifically. And his whole thing, of course, is he has a great interest in Chinese ink painting, and he takes photographs that share that aesthetic. Now, some of you may know that he and I have been doing collaborations since 2009, where he prints his image on a sheet of Shred paper, and then I paint around it. This one is actually a pair. It's called Perspectives, where he's printed his photo in a triangular form, and then I painted around it. Now, you might not notice at first, but this is exactly the same image turned upside down. So the reason I did this was, just because I thought it would be fun to see Michael's reaction, because he didn't expect me to turn it upside down. But what happens is you get a completely different kind of view, even though the triangular part is actually a real image of nature. And here's a more recent pairing, where this is one of the first times that he's actually taken a color image. And in the first one, I've painted around the color image just with ink. And in the second one, I've also used color. So this is also the same image, one's printed slightly smaller. And so we've been playing with this kind of idea. And I just wanted to show that, there are ways. I have not wanted to do anything gimmicky. I haven't wanted to do something contemporary for the sake of being contemporary. But these are ways that I feel like I am being true to the basic tenets of the tradition as I understand it, or following the lineages that I think are valid, and yet coming up with something that is new. I was meant to talk about some other artists, and because I was going to mention other artists who are doing different things, but because the time is limited, I would have had to, be very selective, and that wouldn't be fair. So I thought I'd talk about one artist, me. But mention to you that I don't know if any of you are going to San Francisco for Asia Week, Bay Area Asia Week I guess it's next week from the 3rd to whatever. There is a show that includes a lot of contemporary ink painters at a gallery near the airport called Nanhai, if anybody's interested. And I urge you all to pay attention to that gallery, and if you're in the area, go have a look at the show. So now, we're going to switch to the GoPro. Amazing. Now, I don't know, how much time do I have?
You're fine.
Huh?
You're fine.
I'm fine. Do you think I should take questions first?
I think people are really eager to see you demonstrate, so.
That's what I was afraid of. I can actually do both. All right, so, this is a hard thing to do, but I'm going to try. This is cool, though. So here, by the way, if you have time after, have a look. I brought 2 hanging scrolls that are complete and mounted, and of course in the museum, that's how you see them, hanging. But I wanted to point out that they're actually done on paper or silk. I use, I don't really paint on silk. But I brought, if anybody interested later, different kinds of paper that you can touch. So they have different absorbency, different thickness. This type of paper, usually, people say it's rice paper, which is a misnomer because it has nothing to do with rice. But handmade papers made from bamboo fibers or mulberry fibers, different kinds of paper. These are very thick. I tend to like paper that has more tooth and is less absorbent. A lot of artists, Chinese painters working today, use a very smooth, absorbent paper, and that has to do with the style that they like, which often is a washier kind of like I don't know, like Chibai Shi with broad brush strokes and very lots of ink. As you probably tell from what I showed, I like to go for that dry brush approach. And so I just brought for you, just to look real quickly, this is cool, you can do that. I'll also do it this way. These are unfinished things. And also just art historians like to talk about an artist's style evolving in a certain direction, but I just want to show that these two paintings are done on the same day, and it's not a problem to sort of go back and forth from one mode to the other. I mean, clearly this one is less, let's say, traditional, which is that dangerous word, but it's certainly not a conventional kind of landscape. But I think the point that I'm trying to make is that for me, they're not really that different, because what I'm most concerned about is the line quality, the variety of line, the texture of the line, the flavor of the line is more important than what I'm actually drawing. So whether I'm doing this one, which looks like, it's just random lines, or the other one, which is more clearly a landscape structure, to me, it doesn't make all that much difference. So now what I'm going to do is just talk real fast about the materials, just a little bit, and then I'll try my hand at scribbling something. I've already cut some sheets of paper. So I use very traditional techniques and very traditional materials. And without getting into the specifics of it, these are more or less the same kind of materials that have been used in China for literally a couple of thousand years. You can find brushes and inkstones and ink sticks that date way back to the Tang Dynasty, in the 8th century tombs or whatever, and the structure of the brushes and everything else is pretty much what we use today. And that's one of the things, frankly, that I find appealing, is that we are using the same materials and the same surface, more or less, paper or silk, and trying to grapple with some of the same technical issues that artists from all times have grappled with. Now, very simply, these are my travel versions of an inkstone. This is a round one with a cover. It's not a good one, it's convenient. And an ink stick. So this is a block of ink that's made from, basically burnt, it's essentially charcoal that's put into a mold, and you make the ink by adding water and grinding it. And this is the way it's always been done forever. The brushes are the key. Now, I'm not going to get into the details. People are really into the tools, and there are people who collect the brushes and they make a big deal about it. Basically, there are white ones and there are brown ones. The white ones are softer and the brown ones are stiffer. But the real key to the Chinese brush, God, this light is hot. Anyway, sorry. The real key to the Chinese brush is that whether it's the white one or the brown one, there's a kind of an inner core that is, the hairs are shorter and stiffer on the inside, and then outside there are longer, softer hairs. So what happens is you get some bounce in the brush. And it also serves as kind of a reservoir. So the ink will hold your ink in the inner part and also allow you to get some I would say bounce on it, so it can react in a very sensitive manner. So Western watercolor brushes, sable brushes, cost an arm and a leg, but these brushes are a few bucks, and they do really great things. All right, so now the real key. What I would like to say after having done this kind of painting for 50 years or something, the technical side of it is relatively easy. There isn't that much to the technique of holding the brush and doing landscape paintings. What's really hard is the perception side of judging what's good and what's not good, and being able to control not so much your hand, but use your eyes to see what is a good line and what's not a good line. Now, I should say that this is my interpretation as passed down to me in my lineage. So there's lots of other artists who have a different interpretation of what good brushwork is, but I can only speak for myself. That's the other reason I didn't want to mention any other artists, because they may have other ideas. But I found that the simplest way to explain what I'm talking about, the difference between a good line and a bad line. Okay, this is twine, and it's more or less rounded. So it's string or twine that's more or less rounded, no matter how you make it into a shape like this. If you're describing the outside of it, right, or even if you look at the shadow, it creates a certain shape. But the line itself, if you imagine this as your brush line, the line itself is round. So no matter how you twist and turn it and create whatever shape you create, the line itself is round, as opposed to a ribbon, which is flat by nature. So you can do the same thing, and you can twist and turn it, and you can create the same kind of a shape, but the ribbon itself is flat. So for whatever reason, and there are kind of philosophical reasons, whatever reason, the Chinese literati artists decided that the round line is what you're going for, and you're trying to avoid the ribbon line because that's flat. So the difference between round and flat. So that's really the most important thing that I learned from Cece Wong. It took me, many years to even understand what the heck he was talking about. So you have the advantage that I can sort of explain it. So also, you'll read probably if you read about how paintings, how you're supposed to hold the brush, they always read that you're supposed to hold it straight up and work like this and move your wrist. Well, we don't do that at all. The way that I was taught to hold the brush, and this is really the secret, is like this. At an angle, and the wrist doesn't move, the fingers don't move, all the movement comes from the shoulder, and the energy comes from inside, and so this is very odd because you probably, my problem is I draw very light, so you may not see anything at all. And also what happens is you start by with light ink, and you because you can't go, once you put dark ink down, you can't go over it. So the idea, generally speaking, you start with light ink and work in layers from light to dark. Also, it makes sense because as you're grinding the ink, as the water evaporates, the ink becomes darker. Anyway, so I'll stop talking for a little bit and just start scribbling. So this is, this is the beginning maybe of a tree, but the same kind of line, the same kind of technique you can turn into a rock. Or anything else, or just make random patterns. So for the most part, there's the default. Let's put it this way: the default position is to hold the brush at an angle and just use the very tip of the brush. And so, no matter whether I'm going this way, or up or down, really the angle of the brush doesn't change much. So this is nothing at the moment. So I think if anybody wants to ask questions, I can multitask. But somebody has to field the questions while I just put my hands on autopilot.
I got one. How do you come up with your compositions, and do you generate it like you're doing it right now in free form, or do you do model?
Did everyone hear the question?
Yeah, so how do I come up with the compositions? And I think, yeah, that's a good question. That's part of the problem with learning this traditional technique is really the only hard and fast way of learning. The tried and true method is to learn by copying, and this relates to Chinese calligraphy as well. If you think about it, there's only one way you can learn calligraphy. That's by copying somebody else's calligraphy, and you either do it through a reproduction or by an original, and because this so-called Chinese literati painting uses calligraphy in a way as a model, that's how they learned how to paint as well. So the same idea in calligraphy, you learn a particular style, a particular script form, and then you learn different, over time you learn different forms and different styles, and then if you have the talent, you eventually merge it into your own personal style. And that's the attitude that one uses for landscape painting as well. Now the problem with landscape painting is if you learn by copying, you may sort of get a sense of the brushwork and so forth, but there's a danger of sort of, it's difficult to break out of the compositional mode, because we pretty much, and I should say that to start, I'll start over. Because of the nature of the materials, you can't really erase like charcoal or pencil, even though I like that charcoal equality, you can't erase it. And unlike oil painting, you can't gesso over it or paint over it. So because the paper is so absorbent, whatever mark you make will be evident even after you finish. So you can go to some extent you can go dark over light. But what that means is, as you're planning the composition, it means whatever is going to be seen as in front of something else, you have to paint first, or you have to leave space for it. So, for example, now I'm painting a tree because I have to paint the tree, or at least block it out. So, and then I can paint the rock under it. And then you can paint behind it, if you see what I'm saying. So in other words, if I'd painted the rock first, there would be a line through the tree. And sometimes that happens, which is also acceptable. But so that's just something to keep in mind. So if you see a waterfall, for example, in one of these paintings, you have to leave that white space blank. So you paint around the waterfall. If you see the mists and the clouds, you have to paint. You're not actually painting the white because you're not using white pigment. You're actually painting around what will be seen as the white clouds. So that's something to keep in mind. So what, in answer to your question, in terms of composition, that's one of the biggest obstacles, or one of the biggest developments, is the difference between somebody who can copy well and somebody who can create their own compositions. So, you know, it's, I guess in music, not everybody's a composer. So even if you can play the classical compositions, doesn't mean you can write your own. So we try to do a little of each. So a lot of all these so-called innovations, so Zhang Daqian with the splashing of color, my teacher Cece Wong, I didn't explain this to you, but he sometimes would take a piece of paper and roll it up, or crunch it up and dip it in ink and stamp onto a blank sheet of paper and use that as a basis of a composition. Even my working in conjunction with the collaborations with Michael Cherney, part of the reason for that is that you're forcing yourself to develop new compositional possibilities. In other words, if he starts me with a photograph, in a way that's easier. One of the hardest things is to actually start a painting, because you have to have some kind of composition in mind. So it works in a mutual way. So after Cece Wong has done these and created sort of new modes of composition, then he can take that back into his head, and then when he does just free-form paintings, he's already influenced by things he's learned. So when I work with Michael Cherney and work from the photographs, I get something out of that then can appear in my own compositions, if you know what I'm saying. And it doesn't have to be conscious. In fact, it's better if it's not. That's a really, really good question. The question, if you couldn't hear it, is if when I'm doing my own compositions, do I visualize the image and then or do I just improvise and see where it leads? Well, clearly that's what I'm doing now, and that's basically how I work. And that's another difference of this kind of painting, I think, is that I think even a lot of contemporary ink painters that I've met. They have in their mind a kind of image that they want to put on paper. So their goal is to figure out a way to get what's in their head onto the paper. And I don't do that at all. I just let the brush tell me where it wants to go, and I try to follow along. And that's a little bit more, I think, like the particular masters that I emulate of the 14th century, where there's much more of a quality of improvisation. And sometimes they go wrong too. So that's all right, start over. Any others? Say that again? Oh, okay. It's actually, it's hard to do because you have to wait till it dries. But for example, let's see. She was interested in seeing how you get this layered effect, and was hoping I could do like one detail area and sort of demonstrate how you build it up in layers. So I don't, can you even see that? Does that show up at all? So that's, you sort of have this.
If anybody has any questions, I can run this microphone to them. Can we get this mic up? You can just raise your hand and I can run a microphone to you if you have a question.
So a lot of things can happen, like if you wet the paper first, and then you can do this kind of stuff with the sort of wet and wet. These can be trees or whatever. And you can let it dry and go back in later. And so here's some very light lines. But
did you ever have signs of civilization or man in your paintings and stop doing them? Or did you just always never do them? You said you don't put
sorry,
people.
I'm not hearing.
Can you raise it up a little bit closer?
You said you don't paint people or signs of
People?
civilization or houses. Did you ever do that and give it up? Or did you never do it?
Yeah, I kind of decided that I don't paint people because I don't particularly like people. And I think the landscape would be a lot better off if it weren't for the damn people. So that's my contribution to the war on climate change.
This does not describe his personality at all.
I noticed when you picked up the pieces of paper and carried them over to the table that they had a little bit of a rumpled quality, and I'm wondering if you can talk about the process of what happens with the piece of paper. Does it get ironed, or how does it get smoothed out when it goes onto the scroll?
Sorry. Say that again.
It looks like in the process of working, it's okay if the piece of paper gets a little wrinkled or
wrinkled,
crumpled.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
could you talk about the process of?
Right, so what happens is, so naturally it's going to get crinkled or wrinkled. And so this is the first phase. And of course, most of us are used to seeing paintings in museums and in cases either framed or hanging scrolls or whatever. So that's why I brought a couple of my mounted work. This is kind of nice. Good suggestion to do that, whoever said it. Sorry. So what happens next is that you end up mounting this using a wet mount technique where you lay it face down and with the light rice paste, flatten it out wet, and then put a backing sheet on it. And so all the wrinkles disappear. Some artists like to mount it first, but I don't mind at all having the accidental effects that creases or fibers in the paper create. I actually like that. But yeah, so in the end, when it's mounted into scroll form, so you see on these scrolls, the borders are actually separately mounted. The silk is actually separately backed, and then it's all pieced together and backed again. So if you look at it carefully, the painting itself is not touching the silk. It's like a mat, and they're backed by a common sheet of paper. It's a very good system. You can roll it up, and it doesn't get exposed to light, and you can carry a bunch of them from New Jersey in one tube.
Can you show me how to hold your brush when you do calligraphy? You hold the
Well,
same
you
way?
know, I'm not very good at calligraphy. So, I mean, the problem is, because I didn't learn Chinese till much later, I started by writing calligraphy, but I don't think you want to know how I know my limitations, and I can write a little, but if you want to learn calligraphy, there are a lot better people.
But how do you hold your brush?
But yeah, vertically.
Same way? Same
This-
way?
this-
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so for painting though, see that's also another, I would say, I don't know if it's a misconception or we just have a different approach. A lot of people talk about, you know, because calligraphy and painting, and I talk about this too in terms of philosophy and in terms of aesthetics, they have a common root and common materials. But it was actually kind of mind-blowing when I met Cece Wong and he taught me how he uses the brush, and he also does calligraphy, but to realize that the technical aspect of painting landscapes and doing calligraphy is not the same. So, you know, that's interesting. And I will say that what I've talked about the round brush event, right, round brush as opposed to flat brush, does hold up. If you go back and you look at the great masters of the past, you'll see, once you can see this, you'll realize that in fact, that's one of the criteria that separates the great ones from the not so great ones in our particular way of looking, which was the main orthodoxy from at least the 14th to the 19th century. So we should wrap it up.
One last
Any more quick ones?
I have one little question on the calligraphy compared to the painting. In calligraphy, you're sort of used to seeing the brush pressed down and then up, and so wider and narrower and so on. But it looks like when you're painting, it's all like seal script. You know, it's all wire and
Yeah,
no flat.
I think that's true. And again, this isn't the only style or the only way of doing it, but it explains the orthodoxy. It explains the way that the scholar painters have always talked about who was the best and who wasn't. Doesn't mean other things aren't as good. Of course, I can make lines that are modulated, and a lot of people think that's good. From our snobbish elitist point of view, that's exactly what you don't want to do.
But in calligraphy, it's okay. In calligraphy, it's okay,
Calligraphy, not really. Not really. It has to be centered. So anything that's overly expressive, which, you know, modern people tend to like, there are other qualities that are more important, like holding, you have to hold back. You don't want to expose it. So it's like, you know, Tai Chi trend, Tai Chi. It's like all soft and internalized, as opposed to karate, which the force goes out. So what we're doing here, and in fact, that's more of the philosophical reason about this rounded brush technique, is that it keeps the energy within the stroke.
We've already hit 3:20.
And that's all I know, so just in
And so
time.
what I would like to do, first I'd like to thank Arnold for coming today. And as I think that you saw in the slides of his work and that you'll see in the two finished paintings, one of the things that I have observed about his style, even though he says that he does, you know, different things in the same day, it seems to me that he's getting ever more ethereal and magical as time goes by. And part of that is his ability to manipulate this very fine, faint line. And when we were looking at it from here, I think it might have been hard to see because it's so faint, but you can see in the finished paintings what happens with the multiple layers. So I'd like to invite you to come up, but be very careful. Do not lean over the paintings. If you're wearing a long scarf or a necklace, don't do that either, because we don't want something landing on the paintings. But they will be a good example of you seeing technique. Turn the lights brighter on the paintings, he asks. And then you can also see, I think, the samples that he has on the desk. I think that would be fun to see, so I invite you to come up and take a look. Thank you for being here today.